Welcome once again to Along the Rio Grande. I'm George Torok, and today we're visiting with Dr. Oscar Martinez. He's a Regents Professor of History at the University of Arizona. Dr. Martinez spent a lot of time in the El Paso area in the 1970s and 1980s teaching at UTEP, and he's going to talk to us a little bit today about the border, some of the history of the border, and some of the different areas of interest that he's developed over the years and projects that he's involved in. Dr. Martinez, welcome to Along the Rio Grande.
Thank you.
Maybe we can start talking a little bit about the border. What is a border? Is there a definition or something that we can explain as a border?
Sure. Simple definition is a line that divides, and in our case, we have an international line that divides Mexico from the United States, but we live with borders all around us. Neighborhoods are divided by borders. Classes are divided by borders. There's all kinds of borders.
So these are sort of political and economic lines that develop over time?
Political, economic, social, cultural, racial lines, all kinds of borders.
And the United States-Mexico border, is there something unique about that? Is there something different from other borders, or is it very similar to borders around the world?
Well, borders have universal functions. Borders are meant to regulate the flow of people and products across any international boundary. Borders are designed to keep out influences that are unwanted in one country from the adjoining country. And depending on the relationship between one side of the border and the other, the degree of control, the degree of regulation is different. But in general, everywhere in the world, you have this function.
Sure.
However, there are significant differences between the U.S. Mexico border and other borders. This is a long boundary, 2,000 miles. Another thing that's very different is that you have population centers, many population centers along the U.S. Mexico boundary that are significant both in the context of Mexico and the United States. You have major cities like Ciudad Juarez, El Paso, and Tijuana, San Diego, and a significant amount of economic activity takes place along this boundary. The level of economic, social, and cultural interaction along our boundary is huge, and it's very intense. And you don't find that in other borders around the world. You find that to some degree along the U.S.-Canadian border, but nothing like this border. So
it's not common to have a big metropolitan area on both sides of the border?
Not very common, but you do find examples of that in various places. But it's not common to have these twin city complexes, as many as we have along the U.S.-Mexico boundary.
And it's a great concentration of people, especially in the mid and late 20th century, that have kind of been pulled to the border.
Right. They have been pulled to the border from the interior of Mexico and from the interior of the United States as well, and they have been attracted here by economic opportunity, which is a very interesting development historically up until the last half of the 20th century. Population centers along international boundaries were few and far between. International boundaries were not really centers of great economic attraction. And in regions of the world where you had tensions among nations, borders were very important for security reasons.
Our border 100 years ago or so, very different than what it is today.
Very different. Yeah.
What was our border like then?
Well, 100 years ago, we're talking about 1900, sparsely populated. The level of economic activity was very small in comparison to what it is now. The U.S. was concerned with security on the border. Mexico was still concerned about the U.S. Trying to gobble up more of Mexico because that had happened only half a century before. So there was a lot more tension back then than there is now.
What started to draw people to the border? When did that process take place? Is it early in the 20th century that changes develop?
Well, you have that phenomenon in the 19th century. After the establishment of the border, you find instances of migrations from Mexico to the U.S. and from the interior of the U.S. To the border on a lesser scale. But that phenomenon begins right then, and it grows slowly throughout the latter part of the 19th century. But it's in the 20th century when you have a number of developments at different stages of the 20th century that create economic conditions that offer opportunities to people, especially from the interior of Mexico, to migrate to the border in order to better their economic circumstances.
And does the Mexican Revolution somehow draw attention to the border from both sides?
Oh, the Mexican Revolution is huge in the 1910s in focusing attention on what is going on the border. There are military concerns, there are political concerns. The revolution has deep impact on the economy. The revolution unleashes a migratory stream from Mexico to the U.S. The revolution creates tensions in these communities, especially El Paso, Ciudad Juarez. It's a very, very interesting period, very tense period.
When do the two countries become more cooperative? When do the wounds of the revolution heal and some more of this economic development start to take place?
That begins in the 1920s, during the period of Prohibition in the United States. There is a different kind of attention focused on the border. Tourism booms in the Mexican border cities. Lots of Americans come here. For example, they organize conventions in El Paso and then adjourn their business proceedings early in the afternoon so that they can cross the border into Juarez and take advantage of recreational activities available in Juarez. So that helps to increase the economic interaction. But by the 1920s, Mexico is on the road to economic recovery from the revolution. It's also beginning the process of political reconstruction, political stability. And on the U.S. side, the 1920s is a period of economic expansion, and the Southwest participates in that, and the American border cities are a big part of it. So these new conditions bring about a better relationship between Mexico and the United States. And the problems that you see on the border since the 1920s are problems created by increased economic interaction and very different from the problems that existed before, which were produced by military conflicts, political conflicts, significant ethnic tensions that existed along the boundary, concern on the part of Mexico about the United States possibly invading Mexico again and taking more of its land. That changes in the 1920s, and you see a more cooperative climate taking place, and it's all for the better.
Is this a period of time when manufacturing starts to come to the border areas, or is that something that develops a bit later? How do we think of industries today along the borders? When does that become an important part of it?
Manufacturing is present on the border in the late 19th century, early 20th century, mostly on the U.S. side. There is some small manufacturing on the Mexican side. But the kind of industries that we have now, those are very new. That doesn't start until the mid-1960s. The assembly plants, the maquiladoras, the border industrialization program, that doesn't begin until the mid-1960s.
And that's what really picks up the pace as far as population, people drawn to the area?
Yeah, the border industrialization program is a huge development for both sides of the border, but particularly for the Mexican side. It draws a lot of population from the interior of Mexico. And you see a demographic expansion in Juarez, Tijuana, Matamoros, Reynosa, all these Mexican border communities. And of course, there's a spillover effect into the United States,
sure.
and you see expansion as well on the U.S. side, and more migration from the interior of the U.S. to the U.S. border cities because of increased economic opportunity.
And these places become large cities. They become significant cities in Mexico and both the United States.
Right, right, they do. Although in the case of Juarez and El Paso, these cities were already important before the mid-1960s. They were already important in the national and international context. A city like San Diego and even Tijuana, these cities were pretty significant. But it's the developments of the late 1960s and the industrialization program in particular that really propels them into a position of economic leadership, and even a position of being on the cutting edge of global industrialization.
Are there other borders around the world where that type of process is taking place, or is this something, again, kind of unique to the U.S. Mexican border?
Well, it's unique to the U.S. Mexico border in the sense that this industry, this activity is so huge, and it's located in all the border communities, and particularly concentrated in Juarez and Tijuana. No other border in the world has a similar situation. But the concept of offshore industries did not start here.
Right.
It started in places like Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Singapore. And that's where the people who set up these industries in Mexico, that's where they went to see how this worked and to introduce the concept to Mexico.
Now, you've spent some time studying the culture of the border, or the many cultures of the border. What exactly do we mean by the border? How far does it extend? Is Albuquerque the border? Is Chihuahua the border?
You have to define the border in a way that doesn't take you, in all directions. The border per se consists of the communities that are immediately adjacent to the international boundary.
Sure.
You can look at the counties from one end of the border to the other on the American side, and define those as the U.S. border, and then the Mexican municipios on the Mexican side. Beyond that, you begin to enter a secondary zone that has border influences, but clearly is not part of the core border.
Sure.
So a place like Albuquerque is in what I would call the interior borderlands, where Albuquerque has not been shaped by the forces that are generated in the vicinity of the international boundary, but is impacted in some ways by these forces. For example, migrants who cross through here and wind up in Albuquerque, and the influence that they take back and forth. Products that flow through the boundary and wind up in Albuquerque, including illegal drugs. These are all border impacts, but Albuquerque is clearly not a border city.
Sure. Within that, though, there's kind of sub-regions or places where influence filters out from different areas of Mexico to different parts of the United States. What are some of those distinctions?
Well, I think of this as corridors that extend from border communities to various places in the United States. El Paso, Juarez has a significant influence on places like L.A. and Chicago, because so many people who cross here, wind up in Los Angeles or wind up in Chicago, and there are kinship connections between populations there and populations here, and then populations in Mexico.
Do they
so
tend
cultural
to draw?
Influences are going back and forth, and economic and social influences and cultural influences are going back and forth.
Does Juarez tend to draw people from certain regions of Mexico? Tijuana from other regions?
Yes. That is an interesting phenomenon that differentiates various border cities. Ciudad Juarez draws people from the central parts of Mexico. You have to understand Mexico's geography here, that there's a huge mountain chain along the western side of Mexico, another huge mountain chain along the eastern side of Mexico. And there's a central plateau and central valleys, and through the central part historically have come huge numbers of people who have wound up in El Paso, Ciudad Juarez, or in other places that are connected to this particular spot. And then you look at a place like Matamoros and Brownsville, and they're drawing population historically from northeastern Mexico or from points in southeastern Mexico. And then you look at a place like Tijuana and San Diego, and they're mostly drawing people from western Mexico, western central, northern central, and southern Mexico.
So there's some variations in Mexican and Mexican-American culture along the border, depending on the areas that people come from.
Absolutely, absolutely, there's variation.
You also done some work with the types of people that live along the border, and talked about how some of them blend into the environment a bit more easily than others. Some are actually isolated from much of what's going on. What different types of groups of people live along the border?
Well, the three major population groups that we have are Mexican Americans and Anglo Americans on the U.S. side of the border.
Sure.
And then Mexicans on the Mexican side. Within each of those groups, you have people who are what I call transnational borderlanders, and others who are national borderlanders. What I mean by that is that the people who have a national orientation reflect one culture, one language, and their lifestyle is also reflective of national norms, and they have been influenced to a very limited degree by the international environment in which they live. But the transnational borderlanders are people whose lives has been significantly influenced by the international environment, by the influences that come from the other side of the border, which means that in the case of Mexicans, you have a significant component of the population over there where people speak English to varying degrees, and they are familiar with American culture and American values. A lot of those people do their shopping in American stores, American malls, and so therefore to a significant degree they're living a lifestyle that people live over here. And if you look at Mexican Americans and Anglo Americans, you find portions of those populations that also reflect that international lifestyle. But in the case of Anglo Americans, you find many people who, the vast majority of Anglo-Americans really doesn't have this international orientation. Right. They're mostly a nationally oriented people.
What kinds of things tend to draw people into that transnational mode?
Primarily economic need. Economic need is the driving force that causes people to transcend the international boundary, and then with that to transcend cultural and social boundaries.
So if an Anglo-American does business in Ciudad Juarez and interacts with people there, they become more comfortable with that culture and then take on more of those customs and things along the way.
Absolutely. And the classic example of that is the maquiladora
Sure.
manager, who has to function on the job on the Mexican side and immediately has to get acquainted with the customs of Mexico, with the Spanish language to some degree, and so forth. And like it or not, they acculturate. They have to acculturate to what is there.
Now, we've talked about a large number of people being drawn to the border, and now that we're in the 21st century, there's a lot of discussion of problems along the border. What do you see as the main problems along the U.S. Mexico border? What types of things have developed?
Well, the major problems are migration and drugs. These are problems that have been going on for quite some time. In the case of migration, you find controversies going back to the 1920s, big controversies, and that has continued ever since. And in the case of drugs, you find controversies going back that far as well, but a lot more subdued. With drugs, the big controversies began to emerge in the 1960s and have continued to the present time.
And is this something you think that the border is going to be able to deal with? Is this something that situations that are improving, or?
At the moment, you know, they're as bleak as they've ever been. But I'm an optimist, and I look at historical trends, and I see improvement ahead of us. A generation from now, I think things are going to be different. Mexico has made big strides in controlling its population growth rates and lowering the population growth rates from a high of 3.5% in the 60s down to 2% now. That's going to have an impact a generation from now, and the number of people crossing the international boundary is going to be a lot less than it is now. And Mexico, I think, will also be a more highly developed country economically by then. And so this will not be as big a controversy. It'll be a declining controversy. Drugs, the ball is on the U.S. side of the border, on this one.
Sure.
There's not much that Mexico can do. Sure, they can try to do more with the narco traffickers in Mexico and lessen corruption and all of that. But really the cause of the problem is not Mexico. The cause of the problem is the U.S.
Sure.
Consumers in the U.S. and complicated by a policy of militarization on the part of the U.S. along the border with the war on drugs.
Sure.
These are the big problems. And I think that eventually the U.S. is going to legalize drugs, because it can't win the war on drugs. It's a futile war, and it's a wasteful and extremely destructive war, and more Americans are going to realize that and eventually create the political pressures to bring about change in that one. So I would predict that 30, 40, 50 years from now, we won't have these two problems.
Oh. Good. Changing the subject a little bit, we only have a couple minutes left, but one of the things that you've been working with lately is some of the areas of heritage tourism, working with the El Paso Community Foundation. What types of things are you involved in there?
I'm working with the Paso de the North Heritage Corridor project at the El Paso Community Foundation. Working with Virginia Camendo, who's the executive vice president at the foundation, and Gary Williams, who's the director of the corridor. And the objective is to promote, to preserve the rich heritage that we have on the border, to make it known to people who live here and people from other parts of the border. You know, there's an inferiority complex in El Paso Juarez and other parts of the border. There's a defensive posture that people take on the border, because of all the negative publicity that that we experience. The border area is stigmatized, deeply stigmatized, and people who live in the border area don't realize how important this region is to both countries, and the significant roles that the border areas have played in the histories of both countries. Some very, very important things have happened here, and there is lots in our history and our heritage to be proud of. And we're trying to promote the idea that we need to be proud on the border. We especially need to teach these things to our children and develop a sense of pride instead of a sense of shame.
And you've been doing some writing to do that? You've been working with some publications that will get the word out?
Yes, we've been publishing booklets. We have one that tells the story about the creation of the boundary. We have another one that's about to be published that tells the story of Native Americans in the Pass of the North area. And then another one that's in the writing stage that deals with immigration, and then another one that's also being written that deals with children on the border.
Oh, well, that's terrific. That sounds like a wide variety of things that you're involved in, and it's good to have an optimist who is going to work with that and present a good picture of El Paso and the Ciudad Juarez area in the future. We want to thank you, Dr. Martinez, for coming in today and visiting with us on Along the Rio Grande, and we want to thank all of you as well, and we hope to see you on our next program.